lot. And sorry for keeping everyone waiting. You will have had a chance to finish reading my book in that time, so I probably don't need to say anything about it. So I'll just say a few things about what's in my book, and then maybe we can talk about it. As I've been sort of doing some interviews with my book, a favored way of interviewers to sort of begin the conversation is to say, the rich have always been with us, after all. And actually, that's not true. And one of the points, really the starting point of my book, is to say, actually, things are different now. And we really need to be aware of this new political and economic reality, that income inequality has grown hugely in the United States and in the Western industrialized world, and indeed around the world, and that a lot of the action is at the very top. Is that better? Okay. I'm so short I have to move the mic. A lot of the action is at the very, very top of the income distribution. So to just give you a quick sense of how things have been changing, I'll give you a few quick numbers. So in the 1970s, this is now U.S. numbers. In the 1970s, the top 1% accounted for roughly 10% of the national income in the U.S. That number now is above 25%. What's even more striking is the top 0.1% now. So 10% of the 1% is now close to 8%. So 10% of the 1% is today within sort of kissing distance of where the 1% was in the 70s. That's a pretty big shift. Another way to get a sense of things is now not talking about income, but talking about wealth. If you take the wealth of two admittedly hugely, hugely rich people, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, their wealth is equal to the collective wealth of the bottom 40% of the income distribution in the United States. So two guys are equal to the bottom 120 million Americans. That's also pretty big. Interestingly, and this was a surprise, so I sold my book to the publishers in September 2008, just before the financial crisis. And then the crisis happened, and many people were sad. And I had a particular reason for sorrow, because I thought, oh my God, the entire premise of my book is gone. The super elite is over. It has to be. This financial crisis has happened. Surely the system is going to change completely, and these super fortunes will be wiped out, and there will be sort of a recalibration. So actually, I wrote a new book proposal. But after about 6 months, I was talking to my publishers, and we said, you know what? Actually, that old proposal is still going to work. And the data have borne that out. I like to talk about it as the 1% recovery. So if you look at, and it's really true, if you look at the economic recovery, the numbers are really in terms of sort of the income distribution for the 2009-2010 economic recovery. And a couple of economists, the guys who are the real kind of data jocks on income distribution, especially at the very top, Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty. So they've crunched the numbers for 2009-2010. And they found that in that recovery, and there was an economic recovery, 93% of the income recovery in that period went to the top 1%. And what was even more astonishing, they found, was 37% of the recovery went to the top 0.01%. Now, admittedly, those people at the top had been hit particularly hard, right? Because they tended to have financial assets that had gone down. But that's a pretty big rebound. And in the top 0.01%, it amounted to about 4.2 million per family. So when you think about why is there this polarization in America, why are there these very different views about the world, part of it is there are very different worlds that people are inhabiting. Having said that, so, my premise is that this isn't just a case of the rich have always been with us. Something really different is happening, and it's important for us to talk about it, to research it, to figure out what's going on. But actually, there is a real reluctance, and I would say particularly in America, and I need to admit here I'm Canadian, so I see you guys with a little bit of a distance. Particularly in America, there is a reluctance to talk about these issues of income distribution. And one of my friends, he was supposed to be here tonight, Branko Milanovic, he's a World Bank economist, wrote a great book on income inequality. I talked to him about this, and he said that I'm going to quote him because it was such a nice line. So he said, I was once told by the head of a prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C., that the think tank's board was very unlikely to fund any work that had income or wealth inequality in its title. Yes, they would finance anything to do with poverty alleviation, but inequality was an altogether different matter. Why? Because my concern with the poverty of some people actually projects me in a very nice, warm glow. I am ready to use my money to help them. Charity is a good thing, a lot of egos are boosted by it, and many ethical points earned even when only tiny amounts are given to the poor. But inequality is different. Every mention of it raises, in fact, the issue of the appropriateness or legitimacy of my income. And I think that's absolutely true. And that's why even when you have a discussion about the general issue of income inequality, once you start saying, well, actually, a lot of the action is in the top 1% or the top 0.1%, people get really anxious and you get accused of being a class warrior. And actually, one of my nicest moments so far with the publication of my book is I gave an early talk about this in Chicago, and Bill Daley was on the panel. And he spoke after me, and he started his talk by saying, actually, I guess it is okay to talk about income inequality. It's not class war to talk about it. And I said, yes, Mr. Daley, that's right. It is okay. So what are the drivers? What is causing this really, really big gap? Now here, rather obviously, the people who are most interested in talking about income inequality tend to be on the left. And the left really likes to talk about the political drivers. So the left likes to talk about how taxes have fallen, how the culture has become much more open to really high CEO compensation than it used to be, decline in the rights of unions, deregulation, and all of those things are factors. But I think it's a real mistake to ignore the economic drivers as well. And I think there are very, very powerful underlying economic drivers, and those are pretty obvious. Globalization, the technology revolution. And one reason I think that it's really pretty clear that those are key drivers is this is a global phenomenon. And I do sometimes think the American discourse about it tends to be very American. So I'm always quite entertained when I read about, a paper that says rising income inequality in the United States is due to this one particular law passed in the 1980s. Okay, well then how does that account for rising income inequality in Canada? Or indeed even in France, in Germany, in the United Kingdom. I mean, it's happening all over the world. It's also happening in the emerging markets. And I think it is important to face that squarely, because if you see it just as a political phenomenon, you're going to lose sight of what I think is the biggest challenge, which is that these actually quite benign economic forces, right? I love the technology revolution. I'm a Google addict. Are also drivers of social and political consequences, which are not quite so benign. The way I like to look at it, and this is a quote from Peter Orszag, is how he sees it is he said, look, the big drivers are probably these economic forces. But the issue is that particularly in the United States, the politics, instead of trying to mitigate these very powerful economic forces, has exacerbated them. So even as you have these economic forces creating much, much more concentration at the very top, you would expect politics to sort of try to soften that blow, social institutions to soften that blow. And instead, it's been an accelerant. And to me, that seems just about right. So who are these super rich guys, and what do they think about the rest of us, and what impact do they have? I would say, the way I would characterize them as a group, and this is sort of a global group, is these are the global alpha geeks. So they do tend to be, and this is a difference from a kind of, Downton Abbey setup, and this speaks